Hello lovelies, today we're taking a look at Starblazer Adventures, the rock and roll space opera adventure game by Chris Birch and Stuart Newman, working for Cubicle 7 Entertainment back in the day. This requires some introduction, and as well as looking at the book, we're also realising I need to clear off my desk again. But yeah, it's a bit of a British institution, or was, put it that way. Starblazer Adventures was published as a small format, sort of digest magazine from 1979 through 1991. When it was first published in 1979, it already felt pretty dated in the style of the art, the presentation, the relative lack of edginess in the stories, and so on. 2000 AD, Star-Lord action until it got cancelled after a public furore. Those kind of sci-fi magazines and comics and so on had already seen some success before Starblazer Adventures came out. And was much more modern, much more of the time. In the case of 2000 AD, it was quite punk, it was quite edgy, it was the people who had worked on action, which is hugely controversial at the time, sort of just brought back a little bit into acceptability and given more of a science fiction edge because people were more willing to let things go when it was sci-fi. So Starblazer always seemed a bit tame, a bit old-fashioned, even a little bit childish sometimes, in comparison to those other comics, many of which, other than 2000 AD, were quite short-lived. And this was despite the presence of such later luminaries as Grant Morrison writing for the comic, who also cut his teeth on the Zoids comic, of all things. But yeah, even in its heyday, Starblazer Adventures seemed kinda dated and old-fashioned to people like me who were out buying comics at the time. It was also stymied by the spectacular and consistent incompetence of the publisher, DC Thomson. Not that DC, the British DC. DC Thomson always seemed to have kind of a relative disinterest in all of the comics that they published. They printed them on leftovers from printing newspapers. Distribution wasn't always the greatest. In the case of Starblazer, that was a big part of what caused it problems, the relative lack of distribution, especially compared to the war comics that they published in a similar format, one called Commando in particular. That got plenty of distribution. Starblazer, not so much. You couldn't reliably get it if you wanted to. Starblazer had colour covers. At one time it was just the front cover, later on it was wraparound. It had black and white interiors. The paper quality was so-so. There was usually some science or space-related article on the back of the comic, so you had a little bit of news interest, science interest in there as well. At least around here, Starblazer and Commando were usually dumped as a kind of afterthought at the checkout, usually at W.H. Smith's. These days I don't know where you'd even get it, short of subscriptions. Not that you can, because it's been defunct since the 1990s. It was frequently cheesy, often camp, much more Roger Corman than James Cameron, ironically. This was glam metal space adventure with the occasional smattering of fantasy thrown in, and even a somewhat ill-conceived attempt to turn it into a choose-your-own-adventure format, something that was also tried with several 2000 AD characters in a magazine called Dice Man for a while, and in the main comic in a Slane-based choose-your-own-adventure. But that brings us back to Starblazer Adventures, which is a mad game. It's a mad property to pursue. Probably should never have worked. It was put out by Cubicle 7 Entertainment in 2008. Fate was popular at the time, as was wearing onions in your belt. It came out late, quite late, due to unknown reasons, something to do with editing and layout, as I recall, but perhaps it was something to do with the presence of the notoriously late Gareth Michael Skaker on the editing team. But then it did rapidly sell out when it finally emerged, defying the expectations of many, and deservedly so, because despite the criticism that I may have laid at the feet of Starblazer the comic, it was still enjoyable, if cheesy, and the game is perhaps one of the best Fate implementations that I'm aware of. Now, this is a hell of a book. This is a bullet stopper. This is how many pages? Good Lord. 630 some pages of game book. For Fate, which is supposedly a fairly minimalist story game, but the space is largely put to good use in Starblazer Adventures, unlike in a lot of narrative games. So you do have a full implementation of the Fate rules, but using the 2d6 method. Take the one away from the other. That's 2 added on to what your skill level is. That's the level of success. We just went over Fate Core. I'm not going to reiterate a whole bunch of other stuff there. So you get your usual explainers. They make great use of comic art, either stripped out of the comic or parts of the full comic strips shown in the book, or odd little bits and pieces here and there. So it makes very good use of the intellectual property that it is drawing upon. The rules are explained mostly in a fairly concise way with decent examples, which is always a good way to explain rules. You can see what I mean about the style being somewhat outdated already in 1979, I think. And a lot of European and South American, if I remember correctly, artists were used because they were a lot cheaper. I'm having to work really hard here not to make somewhat racist pronouncements about the Scottish comic publisher and penny pinching here, but it is somewhat true about DC Thompson. So yeah, anyway, you get a well explained implementation of the rules using the 2d6 method. It is the slightly older version of Fate as a base, so it is slightly more granular, slightly more fully featured, slightly more traditional, and slightly less narrative than current implementations of Fate, which to my mind makes for a better implementation of the game and its system, which isn't to say that it doesn't still have all the same issues that Fate normally has. It has all the weaknesses and it has all of the strengths that Fate typically has, right? It's not good for campaign play. It's much better off for one-shots. The relative lack of granularity, while slightly better in Starblazer, is still there. Different types of weapons don't necessarily make that much of a difference, but that kind of suits the freewheeling style of play. So once you're past the rules, the basic rules at least, and the kind of character creation stuff, that is where Starblazer Adventures really takes off, where it really starts to prove its worth, because for all it's tied to the intellectual property of Starblazer, what you really have here, given the nature of the comic, in that it wasn't for the most part ongoing storylines or even multi-part storylines, it was all self-contained stories on a wide variety of different science fiction and fantasy settings. So in trying to cover what was in Starblazer, they end up presenting you with a full toolkit, a full universal system with which you could run almost anything, from modern science fiction, near future science fiction, all the way through to space opera. I mean, necessarily being a more narrative focused game, it's not going to be hard SF for the most part, and even fantasy games and so on. And so you've got stuff in this book that covers everything you might need. Starships, alien races, giant robots, different planets and the aspects they might have, different gadgets, how to organize them, and so on. Spaceship design, vehicle design, and rules for implementing both. Tackling things at small scale through to humongous scale, and how to handle that in your game. Large scale combat, all manner of different stunts, actually sort of laid out so you get a good variety of examples, which provides good guidance for creating your own stunts, obviously centered around replicating things that have appeared in Starblazer, but also much more broadly implementable. Starblazer had a sister game called Legends von Glare, which was based on the more fantasy stories that you found within Starblazer, relatively few of them, but that game takes the material within Starblazer Adventures and makes it even more granular, even more like a traditional adventure, and handles things like big beasts and so on in ways that were kind of hinted at in here, but then are more fully implemented within Legends von Glare. So they're both, great complementary games to get to one another, just as the set of fantasy stories and the science fiction stories, laid alongside each other very well in the comic. And that pretty much covers it, and I'm not even halfway flipping through the book, so I will continue flipping and allow you moments to enjoy the black and white artwork. More books need to go back to black and white, if you ask me. But the other thing I want to talk about here, using the opportunity of Starblazer Adventures, is to talk about some of the problems that Evil Genius games have been having, because it's to do with licensed properties, and Starblazer Adventures is a licensed property. So, can you still get Starblazer Adventures? No, because it's a licensed property, and you have to keep up the licenses. I've dealt with licensing on occasion, negotiated licensing more than once, and it is an extremely stressful and difficult thing to do. And look, the RPG industry, regardless what certain multi-million dollar crowdfunding campaigns might have you believe, it's not a particularly profitable business, and it's a business that doesn't have particularly good margins, right? And when you get a license, it only lasts for a period, fairly typically 5 years or so. If you're lucky, that's 5 years from publication, not 5 years from the start of the project, because delays happen, things go wrong, and that cuts into your profit. Either you're paying a big fee up front, right, which you need to claw back through sales, or you're paying a percentage out of your cover price, right? Could be half of the net profit, could be 10%, could be 5%, but that's more money you're not getting when you consider that. All right, say you're creating a PDF game, right? Maybe you're doing print as well, but let's just look at the PDF. You got a cover price of, I don't know, $20 for a full color, fully featured RPG. Still sounds like a bit much for a PDF to me, but then I'm a terrible businessman. So you're selling that, you're losing 35% immediately to drive through. So that's $7 off, and then from whatever's left, you've got your PayPal fees or whatever else you're using to pay out, then maybe you're paying out shares of what's left to the people who wrote it, people who edited it. Maybe the artists have got a profit share agreement, and then you're losing whatever else there is to the licensor, and potentially losing money on bank fees, transfer fees, all of that kind of thing as well. So while licensed properties might draw attention, I'm not sure that Starblazer particularly will have scored well on that. You know, you're immediately kind of hobbling yourself. You might draw attention to start with, but if you don't follow through with support and a decent product, then you're engaged in an incredibly high risk venture that may well screw you. Mongoose Publishing used to be the masters of this. They've changed their tactics of publication since then, but they used to churn out license after license after license during the D20 boom, and that was their thing, right? Quick turnover, exploit the license to the full, move on to something else, and that worked, but I think it damaged Mongoose's reputation to quite some extent overall. I'm glad they're doing a lot better these days, and that they're treating people who work for them so very well. You can check out my interviews with Matthew Sprang, I think on my other channel, but I'm not 100% whether it's on this channel or that channel. I may have done extracts on this channel. But that brings us back to Evil Genius Games and their current problems. They pursued a lot of licenses, and nobody outside the company, it seems, is entirely sure how they got all these high-profile licenses. And then they were putting them out as a pretty sort of generic D20-ish system. People have good things to say about it, but it just kind of made me yawn, to be honest, looking at that. And I resented the fact that such a pedestrian take was being used on such wonderful properties as, say, Pacific Rim, right? But they appeared seemingly largely out of nowhere with all of these licenses, and now they're in trouble. Now, are they in trouble because of the licensing? In a roundabout way, I think so. You know, they've been accused of using AI art and treating people badly and not paying on time, all of that sort of thing. If they were front-loaded in that they spent a ton of money on all these licenses, and if they weren't turning out that fantastic a product, then it's understandable why they would start trying to cut corners by not paying people on time. Using AI art when they didn't perhaps need to, though it sounds like maybe they needed to. Maybe they used loans to get the properties to pay for the licensing. And are they getting sufficient returns from those licenses or not? Are licensed properties selling in the way that they once did? Modiphius seems to be making a fist of it. And Free League, similarly, seem to be making a fist of it. But are Evil Genius and is their approach? Or is it more of an early 2000s approach? And are people just wary of such generic systems being used on these properties that they really care about? And then you've only got this window, maybe 5 years of selling the product. You don't get the benefit of the long tail model, where you continue to make low-level sales on a product that you've already spent all your effort and time on and hopefully made your money back on. You don't get that with licensed properties. So, yeah, I suspect pursuing licenses often doesn't pay off in the way that a lot of people expect it to. And Starblazer Adventures succeeded regardless of what it was based upon. You know, with the license, you got access to the art. That will probably have saved a lot of money. It was a big, fully implemented Fate system. That was in its favour. And I think it would still be selling if you could still buy it, as would Legends of Anglaire. But you can't. You can't even get it on PDF legally. You have to sail the high seas if you want to get it, and then maybe take the risk of getting it printed and bound somewhere. But that's an enormous shame. And if it wasn't tied to Starblazer, then maybe we would still have it. Maybe we would still have access to it. A bunch of the book is also going through the different stories that are to be found within Starblazer. And so it has added value as a sort of encyclopedia of the comic. But as a game, that doesn't really add that much. But yeah, that's about it, I think. Partly a cautionary tale, I suppose, about licensing and being careful about licensing, and how it means that games become lost over time, become orphaned works. Despite having engaged in licensing myself, I'm still not convinced it's a brilliant move or a brilliant idea for any company, and I suspect that licensing has contributed a considerable amount to Evil Genius's flash in the pan problem. But Starblazer, if you can get it, and it's going for over £100 on eBay and places, if you can get hold of it, it's well worth getting, as is the companion Legends of Anglaire. Zang.
Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
Neverwhere is a book by Neil Gaiman and a TV series from 1996, which has also been produced as a radio play and as a graphic novel. I secured permission in 1997 from Crucial Films and Neil Gaiman's agent to produce a semi-official Neverwhere role-playing game, provided that it not be done for profit. With the Neverwhere RPG, you can follow in the footsteps of the Lady Door and Richard Mayhew Dick in exploring London's mysterious underside, the twilight world just out of sight of normal people. Beware of Knight's Bridge, avoid the Seven Sisters, be cautious of Turnham Green, and walk the byways of the floating market. Neverwhere uses the description system, a bridge between descriptive prose and dice mechanics, to let you really bring your words to life. Available for free at drivethrurpg.com.
Well, I look at it myself as the beginning, really, of an exploration. That's the reason we're exploring. You don't know what you'll run into on an exploration. What the sky looks like, what the stars look like. Do they still twinkle, or are they a steady light when you get outside the atmosphere?